everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today we're going to go over part 2 of Chapter 17 from the Absorbent Mind. Just as a reminder, we're going to be breaking Chapter 17 up into 5 different parts. The first video I put out was the introduction, where we explored the laws of nature. And now today we're going to do the second part, which is about imagination, and the next video that I'm going to do is going to be about language and practical life, followed by sensorial and math. And then finally, we'll end Chapter 17 by talking about social groups. With that being said, let's jump into imagination. That's what we're going to talk about today. Let's start on page 157, and we're going to talk about the child's imaginative powers. Montessori says, is the child's mental horizon limited to what he sees? No. He has a type of mind that goes beyond the concrete. He has the great power of imagination. The picturing or conjuring up of things not physically present depends on a special mental ability of high order. If man's mind were limited to what he actually saw, his outlook would be dreary indeed. And then following this quote, Montessori gives the example of geography, and she talks about showing children the world globe in the following paragraphs. So don't forget to pick up your copy of the book and read what comes next. On page 158, she talks about exercising the imagination. She says, they loved the globe so much that it became the most popular feature of their room. The child's mind between 3 and 6 can not only see by intelligence the relations between things, but it has the higher power still of mentally imagining those things that are not directly visible. Imagination has always been given a predominant place in the psychology of childhood, and all over the world people tell their children fairy stories, which are enjoyed immensely as if the children wanted to exercise this great gift, as imagination undoubtedly is. Yet, when all are agreed that the child loves to imagine, why do we give him only fairy tales and toys on which to practice this gift? If a child can imagine a fairy and a fairyland, it will not be difficult for him to imagine America. She says we often forget that imagination is a force for the discovery of truth. The mind is not a passive thing, but a devouring flame, never in repose, always in action. And this is one of my favorite quotes about imagination. Imagination is a force for the discovery of truth. This can be a very difficult subject to navigate because our society has been sold on fantasy and pretend play for the early childhood education years. But this is also difficult to address in the Montessori world because we often misinterpret what Montessori is saying here. Big business makes a lot of money by selling fairy tales, fantasy, and pretend play toys. They are heavily invested in selling parents on the idea of this concept of fantasy to develop imagination. But let's step back from big business's view of imagination and explore what Montessori has to say about developing imagination. In Montessori primary training, we were taught not to use cartoons. Everything should be real. We should use books with real pictures and give real information to children. This specific approach is referring to working with children in the first plane of development, which is ages 0 through 6. We do this because we are creating the foundation for imagination, because the child is still in a concrete stage of development. Jumping straight into abstract ideas and stories skips over a very important part of development. Children need to develop and build skills concretely during this stage so that they can go on and apply these skills when their minds are more capable of abstract thinking. But even in this age group, we don't deprive them of culture just because there's an abstract quality associated to it. So where do we find this balance of art and culture and concrete learning? This can create some obstacles in the Montessori community. For instance, many Montessori teachers will only allow books with real photographs in their rooms, but they will hang paintings like Van Gogh or Picasso on the wall because we are told to fill the environment with real works of art. Now, let's think critically here. If it wasn't for Van Gogh and Picasso, then we wouldn't have cartoons like we have today. We wouldn't have the animation we have today. It was artists like Van Gogh and Picasso that brought the style of drawing that led to cartoons. So what does this mean for the Montessori classroom? My perspective is that in the 0 to 6 environment, we need to provide as much real and concrete materials as possible and make sure we are labeling and giving language for everything the child encounters. But we should also include beautiful artwork. I've seen toddlers spend several minutes studying pictures by famous artists. They have an interest in it. And the same goes with books. I believe some books reach the category of art, and so I treat them like a work of art. I also use these types of books minimally. There aren't a whole lot of fantasy books out there or cartoon-like books out there that I would recommend or that I would consider a work of art. So that does cut down on the amount that I'm putting in my classroom. My main deciding factor in whether to include a fantasy book in my Montessori environment is whether it is purposeful. We need to offer a balance and think critically about what we are offering children and understand that we want beauty, culture, character, and skills to develop and flourish in our environments. But what about the older children? What about the children over the age of 6? How does imagination and truth fit together in these age groups? What type of literature should the child be reading at the older ages? And should you be worried about them reading too much fantasy or science fiction? Here's my perspective on storytelling with fantasy and science fiction. The abstract world of fantasy and storytelling is one where the concrete details of the world are changed or distorted. These stories seek to tell the tale of the human soul. These greater truths become elevated with fantastical backdrops. When fantasy enters the picture, the abstract truths must be elevated. And these truths must be ones that apply to all human beings, and they are not limited to race, culture, or gender. Books that disconnect from both reality and the greater truths of humanity are the ones that offer little or no value. The greater human truths that are told over and over again in different ways throughout time and space is why so many people love fairy tales. It's why they love science fiction. It's why they love fantasy. They were seeking truth, often stumbling upon ethical conflicts that they could explore through a fantasy backdrop. That's one of the reasons why fantasy works so well for exploring ethics and the human soul. It allows us a chance to detach from our own lives, our own worlds, and observe an idea from the outside looking in. Fantasy can act as a buffer, allowing us to look more deeply and honestly at a situation that we might be more biased towards if the setting was concrete and real. So that's the value of fantasy. That's the value of these science fiction worlds, fantasy worlds, fairy tales. There has to be a greater truth that's being told if you're going to distort what is real and what is concrete. In the child's mind, before the age of 6, really isn't ready for that abstract type of thinking. Now, they might be entertained by it, and we can't deny that, right? But we can't miss out on that concrete step that needs to happen before the age of 6. So again, my answer to the question of how to approach these fantasy stories for older children comes down to purpose. What's the purpose of this story? Even if the concrete truth of how the world works isn't there, does it compensate for that by offering an even greater truth about humanity? So now that we've reflected on how fantasy works in the younger age group versus the older age group, let's talk more about these concrete experiences. On page 159, Montessori says, people have always thought that to play with bricks and exercise the imagination on fairy tales were two of the child's primary needs at this age. The first was supposed to set up a direct relationship between the child's mind and his environment so that he could know it and master it, thus achieving much mental development. The second was held to give proof of a wealth of imagery, which the child poured out in his games. But by having in his hands something real on which to exercise this powerful force, one may reasonably suppose that he is greatly helped, for his mind is then also brought into contact with the outer world. And here on page 159 to 160, Montessori is going to talk about the adult's response. Now she's really talking about this 0 to 6-year-old age group, so keep that in mind as we're going through these quotes. She says, the child of this age cannot follow long explanations, and usually we try to be far too exhaustive. Play, imagination, and questions are the features of this age, and this is known to all, but often there are misunderstandings. Sometimes the questions are difficult. Even to tell the truth is not so easy as it seems. Parents and teachers need a special wisdom to know how to satisfy the infant imagination. Teachers require training. because it is not our logic that can solve these problems. We must know how children develop and give up all preconceived ideas. It needs great tact and delicacy to follow the mind of a child from 3 to 6, and grown-ups seldom have enough. Luckily, the child learns more from his surroundings than he does from us. And if we study the works of all who have left their marks on this world in the form of inventions useful to mankind, we see that the starting point was always something orderly and exact in their minds, and that this was what enabled them to create something new. Even in the imaginative worlds of poetry and music, there is a basic order so exact as to be called metrical or measured. And I just want to put a note in here that this implies that the mathematical mind and the imagination are connected and depend upon one another. Imagination must follow the laws of nature, the mathematical mind, and be purposeful so that it can create something and contribute to society. This connects it back to the use of the hands and real life experiences. And this is also why, even if you're reading a story that's in this fantastical world, it has to be orderly and exact, right? There has to be a form of logic. The mathematical mind doesn't accept stories, even when they're fantastical, that don't make sense, that don't follow some sort of order. So even when we're talking about imagination, that mathematical mind, that logic, and the importance of purpose are still there. And so we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at stories as well, when we're looking at anything involving imagination. So let's summarize what we talked about right here. First of all, what are the child's imaginative powers? Well, he has the power of imagination, but his mind is greatly helped by concrete experiences. And again, we're talking about the 0 to 6 age group here. Now, elementary children, they still need the concrete, right? They need to be aided by that concrete, but they don't need it as much. They're really focused on those abstract experiences. The 0 to 6 age group, yes, they have the power of imagination, but they are greatly helped with concrete experiences. And how should the child exercise his imagination? Maria Montessori says with the use of his hands, through real experience, through the refinement of the senses. We're educating the senses so that he has a better impression of the world. He has a better impression of his experiences, and he can organize them, label them, and classify them. That's going to help with developing imagination later on. We're ordering the mind. We're organizing the mind. And that is a foundation for developing imagination. And so how is imagination related to truth? Imagination is a force for truth. And how do materialized abstractions help a child's imagination? Materialized abstractions are just the way we make something concrete that's abstract, like the idea of the earth. We can materialize that through a globe or a map. The child can put his hands on a globe. So these materialized abstractions help the mind grasp abstract concepts, imaginative thoughts, by offering a concrete experience. And how should adults respond to the child's imagination? With special training and great tact. And remember that the child learns more from the surroundings than he does from us. So keep that in mind, that the child, especially in that 0 to 6 age group, is going to absorb everything around him. And finally, what are those two mental powers of imagination? Precision and order. Imagination is developed through precision and order, and in the 0 to 6 environment, that is really important. It helps the child understand what's going on in the world. It helps him label his experiences, classify his experiences. It helps him have a better impression of what's around him. The child in the first plane of development has a sensitive period for order, and they pick up on precision pretty easily. So the more precise you are in showing them how to do something, the more precise they will be when they do it. During the ages of 0 to 6, the child is putting himself together, and then they turn 6 and something happens and they kind of fall apart a little bit. That's because that abstract mind is taking over and those concrete experiences are not as valuable to them. So just keep that in mind as well. So that's all I have for this video. In the next video for Chapter 17, Part 3, we're going to go over language and practical life. So that's all I have for you today. Remember that this is only a small portion of the chapter, and I really encourage you to pick up the book and read the entire chapter for yourself so that you can get the full impression of The Absorbent Mind by Maria Montessori. And if you like what I do here and you want to support it more, remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you're looking for more teacher resources, don't forget to join my community over at Locals. It's montessoriforeveryone.locals.com. With that being said, I hope I see you in the next video.